Tonight we're talking about the NDC, that is the Nationally Determined Contribution. It is the cornerstone of South Africa's response to climate change that was launched this week for public comment. It outlines South Africa's commitment to the Paris Agreement, other agreements globally around climate change. To discuss, we're now joined by the Chief Director at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, Maesela Kekana. Mr. Kekana, thank you for being with us. So, apparently all countries are updating their NDCs, or this nationally determined contribution, ahead of a big climate change summit in Glasgow in November. So is this basically our contribution to the world effort? Could we put it that way?
Good evening, Francis. Indeed, you're right. The landmark Paris Agreement that entered into force in 2016 require all parties to the agreement to submit their national plans, the ones that you just referred to as nationally determined contributions. So you would recall that the first ones were submitted prior to that conference in 2015, and South Africa did submit. But we have to update them every 5 years. So all parties are updating accordingly.
All right, if our plan is implemented, what are some of the key features? How would it change things for South Africans? We already have a carbon tax, for example. What are we looking at in future?
Yeah, one of the key features of the Paris Agreement is that when you revise your plan, it has to be a little bit more ambitious than the previous ones. Therefore, the plan that we put out for public consultation indicates that, or talks to that, it is a little bit more ambitious to what we put forward, meaning that South Africa has to reduce its emissions, limit and that therefore translate into requirements in terms of how we do things, such as in our energy mix. We have to start seeing more to the coal coming in, such as renewable energies like solar, like wind, and so forth and so forth. But at the same time, it's not just about reducing emissions. It's also about preparing ourselves to adapt to the impacts of climate change. As we know, a lot of emissions that are already out there in the atmosphere will continue to cause climate change. Therefore, countries need to prepare themselves to adapt to those changes that will occur.
In terms of the emissions, Mr. Kekana, we have way more coal stations than the global average. We are a complete outlier there. So are we saying practically, you know, we'll close down certain coal stations? What are we pledging around that?
Well, I'm sure you would recall that our electricity utility, Eskom, has already pledged to reduce its reliance on coal. In fact, they've pledged what they call a net zero. So they plan to phase out coal and replace it with things like solar and wind energy and some gas. And we already have nuclear in the system as well. But of course, Eskom has got its own list and timeframes of when it will decommission which power plants. It is important that you have a plan because the transition to this low carbon need to be just because it affects jobs. There will be those that lose jobs, but there will be new jobs that are created in other sectors. So you need to have that plan. And this is what Eskom is working at now.
Yeah, so that will be put forward at this conference in Glasgow. Mr. Kekana, I remember years ago, and perhaps it's the 2015 contribution time that you're talking about, when South Africa pledged more than it needed to. Many were lauding South Africa for saying, we take this so seriously, we'll go over and above what is expected of us, given the size of our country and where we are in development. Then fast forward a few years, reports around Mpumalanga having some of the worst air quality in the world. Can we say that as South Africa, we are really taking climate change seriously?
Well, this is why we are revising our NDC, because when you reduce your emission, one of the gains that you get it's reduction in air pollution. So if you are going to be phasing out coal in those areas that you mentioned and replacing them with cleaner technologies, that will translate into things like air quality improving drastically and significantly. Of course, you can
sir, I'm saying in light of
continue.
our previous commitments 5 years ago, was that just talk or did we follow up with any action?
Well, it was not talk because if you look at where the emissions were at that particular time and where they are now, significant reduction in terms of emissions if you do your inventory. However, what I'm saying is that you still have a lot of coal in those regions, and therefore you need to do a little bit more, which is what the plan that we are putting forward is.
All right,
So that you can see those changes.
unfortunately, we keep on losing you, Mr. Kekana, at such a crucial point. But I think we got your point there, that it wasn't just talk, that we did make contributions at a similar conference years ago, and our emissions have been reduced. There will be a new conference in Glasgow in November, South Africa presenting its plan around climate change going forward. Thank you very much. That was Maesela Kekana from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Let's